Yeah, great to be sharing in this event today. About a year ago, I was asked by Springer to write a book on massive open online courses. And I did think to myself, there are many books on massive open online courses, so what would be the purpose of focusing on this? So I was drawing on work from colleagues that I've worked with in the past at Glasgow Caledonian, so Colin Milligan, Anush Markarian, and others, and a colleague I'm working with at the moment, Dr. Nina Hood, who's based in Auckland. And we decided to really question some of the claims associated, not just with massive open online courses, but with technology-enhanced learning in general. We really have to think about what we're claiming and what we're doing and see whether there are tensions there. So in the 7 minutes that I have at the moment, I'd like to draw attention to 4 of the tensions that Nina and I identified as we were going through the various claims. So the first tension is this idea that MOOCs help to democratize learning. And our question was, well, are MOOCs and other forms of technology actually doing this? Or are they simply ways of universities, especially the elite universities, stamping their global presence? Now, why might we think that universities are, in fact, reinforcing their global presence? At the bottom here are some sample edX stories. They're amazing stories of success. These are people who studied on edX massive open online courses. And in fact, I could have used any MOOC platform, but you can see here that all of these people seem to be quite high achievers. These are not the learners who are really struggling with some of the basics. They're achieving amazing things, and so we can understand why edX might want to point to these particular stories. But the reason I'm showing you this is because it illustrates in some ways how some of the MOOC platforms are trying to position themselves. And in fact, by having these massive open online course platforms, then the universities are able to not just have their campus presence, but really have this global presence and dominance in saying, well, of course, our education is the elite education, which of course everyone would want to join in. Now, at one level, of course, many of these massive open online courses are very high quality, especially to people who have very limited access to education in developing countries. But still, there are other ways in which people could offer the courses. So I'd like to illustrate one way that we thought was a very interesting application of massive open online courses. And this comes from Kieran. Now, Kieran is a company based in Germany, and they're using massive open online courses to help the integration of refugees into Germany. I have on the slide here the model that they use, but basically their aim is to use the opportunities afforded by MOOCs to make it as easy as possible for refugees going into a country to become part of that country. You will appreciate many of the issues and problems faced by people as they go to a new country of residence, where they have difficulty sometimes with language and certainly with even the ability to work. So Kieran is doing amazing work, and they're making sure that when refugees move around, they can continue to study on these massive open online courses, and after 2 years they can move into a degree program which can help them in the future. So this we view as more of a form of democratization than some of the claims might suggest. One of the second a second tension that we identified was this claim that MOOCs disrupt education. So we hear this all the time: the next technology comes along, this will disrupt education. So our question is, are we disrupting, or are we simply reinforcing the educational norms online? A quote from George here about the reasons why we might not want to, in fact, disrupt. If we're viewing our students as customers, and essentially we're selling courses and resources and qualifications to these customers, then we might not actually want to disrupt the model itself. We might simply want a way of delivering more content and more accreditation to them so that they can pay us more money. Now that could be quite a one-sided view of what we're actually trying to do with massive open online courses and other forms of education. But certainly many of the MOOCs that have been designed require students to progress. There was, in the early days of MOOCs, a lot of discussion about completion rates. Why aren't students completion? Because we were applying the conventional educational rules and norms, cultures, values to MOOCs. When in fact, if we really want to disrupt, we need to turn our thinking about education on its head. So some of the ideas that Lisa was talking about students being able to take forward their own learning, rather than us always focusing on designs, might be a way forward. So I'd like to give a shout out to Annette Dalsgaard, who's a student, PhD. She's a midwifery academic in Denmark. And I want to give a shout out about her work, which was in designing and offering an evidence-based midwifery practice MOOC. Now, Annette wanted to make opportunity for midwives around the world to share the practice, to think about midwifery practice in different cultures and geographic positions, and how they might reflect on their own practice, share ideas, and how that might have an impact on the practice. And that's exactly what she did. She had people from various countries across the world. Some of the people who were studying on this MOOC, professional midwives, had real difficulties, and it was a challenge for them just simply to get online. There was a group of midwives in Myanmar. There were people in quite rural parts of Kenya and Nigeria and so on. But the results from this were amazing, and she had very positive feedback. So here's an example of really disrupting professional education in midwifery practice and thinking about some of the global challenges, sharing ideas. And the knowledge itself is not just written by experts, but by people in practice around the world. So a third tension is about this claim that we're opening access to learners around the world, opening access to higher education. And so drawing on some of the work that Tony and Lisa was talking about earlier, we would question, so are MOOCs really helping everyone? We could ask the same question about open educational resources and all kinds of other technologies that we've made available. Because one of the things that we know is that the people who tend to study in MOOCs are people who already have degrees. They have already learned how to learn. They have the confidence and the motivation to go forward and learn in these kinds of courses. So the efforts to make resources available and to open up education are really being spent on the people who are already privileged and have already had opportunity, rather than rethinking, well, how can we focus this effort on people who really don't have opportunity? I was very inspired by an app which Deakin University in Australia has recently made available to students. It's called the Deakin Genie, and I would urge you to look it up. So this is a tool that helps students plan how they're going to learn. It can be voice activated, It helps them know what's in their calendar or think about their assignments and so on. So it's quite an inspiring tool. But these are the kinds of tools that we tend to make available when we're trying to support the self-directed learning that Lisa was talking about. And in actual fact, there are other aspects of self-regulated or self-directed learning which also need support. So it's not just about planning learning, it's about all the kinds of activities or factors that influence learning. So things like motivation. What is it students actually want to do? Do they know what their motivations and goals are? How do they actually instantiate the way they learn? What kinds of processes do they use when they learn? And how might those be supported? Do they reflect on learning? How do they interact with other people? How do they find the other people and resources to interact with? So we need to really think about analytics tools or different kinds of tools that can support each of these different areas. And of course, there's a problem with the way that we're developing the analytics tools, because each tool is based on an algorithm which has a whole range of different assumptions about education behind it. So if we're thinking in conventional terms about education, we're building that thinking into the algorithms that are driving forward education. So we really need to be careful about that. A fourth tension is really around the different ways that we're supporting this autonomous learning. And in fact, can learners, even if they're able to learn autonomously, can they do that in a MOOC? Or are they expected to adhere to predefined ways of learning? So if we think about some of the early MOOCs, the connectivist MOOCs, we saw Stephen Downes earlier. So these MOOCs were very, very much based on the idea of students taking forward their own learning. But at the same time, there was an expectation that these students would share with others. That's how the whole idea of connectivist MOOCs work. It's sharing. So what happens when people are not sharing and when actually they want to just simply observe or drop in and they don't want to, it's not their intention to share, even if they can? That's very difficult in a connectivist MOOC. In other kinds of MOOCs, which are more structured, of course, there are very predefined ideas that you will go into a course, you will follow a pathway, you will complete, and so on. So we're essentially building in rules. So we want students to learn in an autonomous way and in a way that fits them. There is a bit of a tension in expectations. So we need to make sure that we find different pedagogies and processes and designs that enable learners themselves to decide their paths. And by doing that, then we have to recognize that if I'm a learner and if I know what my goal is, I need various tools and systems that will help me achieve my goal. But of course, over time, then I might find other kinds of resources or people that deflect me. It's not going to be a linear path. And in fact, my goal is very likely to change as my life circumstances change. So I might want to find a more direct path, and I need the kinds of tools that help me find the people and resources to do that. Or I might be going in other directions depending on what my interests are. So we need the kinds of tools that will help students be able to navigate not just the pathway, but have the confidence and the motivation to do that, rather than expecting them to follow these norms. So these are just 4 of the tensions that we've identified just when we analyse what's happening in massive open online courses. And if we really want to have a disruptive and a democratising way of taking forward education, then we ourselves as educators need to rethink how we go forward. Thank you very much.
So, is this
You're gonna
time
sit
for a
there?
question, or do I go up and present?
I don't remember what we agreed on, so whatever you want.
Okay, well, I think there's a lot of resonance between what you presented, what Tony and Lisa presented earlier, and the question that really bugs me is when we talk about these learner skills for self-regulating, self-determining, directing their learning, can those be MOOCified? Can we massify the way that we teach people how to learn, and alongside with that, can we MOOCify the way that we train teachers for that environment?
So I guess what you're asking is, are there ways that we can build this into the design so that we encourage learners themselves to be more autonomous about the learning? And yes, there are. So if you take, for example, the MOOC on midwifery practice, where the learners were giving examples of their practice and sharing ideas and so on, that's one example of becoming more autonomous. One of the problems is it's much easier to support autonomous learning in professional settings. So because people can talk about their work and they generally have a degree of autonomy in their work. What is more difficult and more challenging is at the undergraduate level. And there was a tweet earlier about shouldn't we be instilling this in or teaching or enabling people from school, primary school, to be able to learn. And I think it's a basic literacy. I've been saying this for years, as some of my colleagues know, that for me the one thing that we have to focus on is enabling people to be able to learn. And then when we provide all the free or open resources, or even resources that people have to pay for, they themselves can navigate those resources to achieve the goals that they need to achieve.
I have a related question. Kind of positioning all these different models, I'd be curious what you think about two aspects of this. One, how different are MOOCs from the online courses that came before? So is this a new phenomenon, a new series of tensions, or is this really kind of the traditional way of doing online learning? And then secondly, the question of equity I find very interesting. And we know that the many of the large MOOCs, as you pointed out, mainly benefit learners that are already doing fine or extremely self-motivated. But I wonder if the connectivists MOOCs, which are much more in line with kind of the way I would like to learn, if they aren't having the same problems, because they're also very messy and they're hard to navigate, and you need lots of technical skills and digital literacy. So the question of equity and what are the right models, and then also, is this a new series of tensions, or have we always had to deal with this?
Okay, so I really like Neil Selwyn's take on this, not just about massive open online courses, but about online learning in general, that students come to an environment and experience it very differently. So if you are able to navigate a connectivist MOOC, if you have the confidence in being able to contribute and you know, having your work critiqued by other people, then connectivist MOOCs work for you. But for many people, they just don't have that kind of confidence, and they don't have the skills and the ability to do so. Also, this idea that people then are expected to contribute to connectivist MOOC. Of course, you don't have to, but there is this underlying fundamental that the MOOC is based on people generating and sharing knowledge. So, in other words, the philosophy of the MOOC doesn't work if you don't do that. That negates against the people who are not able to or don't have the confidence to. So there is no equity, of course not, even in the connectivist MOOCs. Now, your first point about massive open online courses, and I think what you were asking was, are these tensions just the tensions that we've had every time a new thing comes along? So I think a lot of the tensions are exactly the same. In fact, massive open online course as a term has become almost meaningless. It's almost used as any form of online learning. A lot of MOOCs are not even open nowadays. They're for fee and so on. But I think there are maybe not new tensions, but tensions that have been accentuated. So this global dominance, for example, when courses are made freely available, and you know, I do think that many of the universities that are making courses available do have an intention to open access to very high quality, well, high quality institutions, if not high quality courses themselves. I think that is the intention. But of course, there are multiple motivations, and some of these are translated into this idea of, well, we don't just have a local dominance, we really do have a global presence, and therefore a global dominance because we are putting forward our view of the world and our way of thinking. That's our view.
All right, so, yeah, shall I? Okay. So I'm going to, rather than talk about things I actually know something about, I'm going to actually share some questions that, you know, I don't have the answers for, and in a way connecting a lot of the things we've been hearing to, okay, what does this mean for higher education? So I'm going to talk about some of the, what I see as a kind of the underlying forces, and then perhaps suggest direction that this, you know, or things we should be paying attention to. So one of the things that we're, you know, dominates this era is data. You know, there's, and these are some figures from IDC, you know, the amount of data we're generating is just exponentially growing. A lot of it is coming from, you know, from embedded devices. So, you know, just by walking around in the world, you're generating data. And this brings, you know, have you, I don't know, every time I go somewhere, you know, suddenly my phone buzzes and asks me questions about the places I've been. I think Google not only knows where I've slept and where I've ate, it has the cheek to ask me for my opinion about it, right? So, and there's you know, there's a kind of a new literacy that we need to develop, which is this data literacy, and I don't think we pay enough attention to that. Now, data has its positive sides, when we're talking about education, and you know, the whole idea of learning analytics that allows us to actually use big data to sort of monitor the way we teach and the way we learn, and both self-regulate and you know, and respond in real time. There's lots of problems with this, aside from the ethical issues. You know, we're getting into the position that essentially what we can measure is what we call education. Right? Whereas if we were talking about values, if we were talking about you know, the sort of self-efficacy, empowerment, and all these things we've been hearing throughout the morning, how can you actually measure those things? So in essence, you know, analytics is actually pushing us even further away from the ideas that we're trying to promote in education. And actually, Allison, you know, is a much greater expert than me on that. So you can just read her report. So the next thing is information. And again, you know, this goes into the sage on the stage. Now, these days, you know, whenever you actually need to learn something practical, wherever you are, you just take your phone and you open YouTube and you search it and you find how-tos. You know, this is actually something I did with my daughter, and you know, we learned how to make a pineapple bush out of you know, the top of a pineapple. And believe me, you know, it's still there. It's still alive in our flat. Up to how to surf, how to make a battery from a lemon, how to put a baby to sleep, and whatever. And again,
what's the whatever?
Well, that was, I thought it was, I just did a YouTube search on the how to, and there's how to how to kiss a French kiss. And I thought it's kind of nice to have that, and then maybe to sleep on top of it. So, but that's maybe the thing is that you get all the information, but you don't necessarily recognize the consequences of that information. So, but definitely, delivering information. If we're in the business of delivering information, then we're out of business. Right. So, as education, we need to kind of chill out on content and realize that it's about time to move on. Now there's the issue of teaching procedural knowledge, and I wonder if my kids can actually understand what that guy is doing. So, and again, a lot of what we talk about is teaching competencies, teaching skills, but the skills that we teach today are probably irrelevant 2 years from now. So, if you think about how to play an LP. Yes, some people still do that, but kind of lifting the needle and gently putting it down. Do you know what I'm talking about? I mean, yeah. Or actually how to burn a CD, right? Think about it. In 2 years, will it be relevant to know how to burn a CD? For that matter, how to drive a car? Okay, so again, what we're teaching in terms of, and we're now beyond content, but this is knowledge of how to do things. And what's the point of teaching that in school or university if it's going to be outdated by the time you graduate? So that's about knowledge. I think the more critical thing is what I call epistemic knowledge. It's knowledge about how to create knowledge. And I put this chart up, right? So all the, you've all read about, MMR in autism or this and that in autism. And, here's the data, organic food and autism. So, there's a real issue of, and this is, the whole fake news phenomena, the whole, deterioration of discourse, of knowledge-building discourse, of knowledge-building practices. Social media definitely playing a strong role there, but also political forces. And this is critical to our life. The way we establish truth is critical to our survival as a species. We've had very philosophical discussions about this over it. What was surprising for me is also how I established truth. Because again, doing some research for this talk, I was looking for, the greatest example would be climate change. Actually, you know what? Republicans are kind of coming around to believe in climate change. And that was, for me, so apparently my perception of Republicans being, climate deniers and so on was not actually based on evidence. We're all susceptible to that, accepting myth when we get through social media instead of truth. And then, so the question is really, how do we get around this? I think this brings me to what is our role in educators. And I think the first thing I said, okay, here's a trick. You ask some students about, well, what's your opinion about X, right? Now, usually what they would do is go and Google X. Now, what we need to teach them is very simple. Just Google scientific evidence for X. Okay? And, this is the kind of thing, when we're talking about, how do you establish truth? There are some practices that even we need to train ourselves to do. And we need to pass those on to our students, our learners. And it's not, as Tony said, it's not rocket science. It's just there's ways that you can evaluate truth rather than just take information as a given. Again, getting back to this question of double loop learning and double loop teaching. So we need to, and of course, this connects to what Lisa was saying, rather than providing students with content, with knowledge, with whatever, ask students, what do you want to learn? How do you want to learn it? how will you know that you learned it? So that brings in the sort of the real inquiry cycle and the evidence. And then in the end, what have you really learned, right? So kind of really structuring or scaffolding that sort of double loop learning process. And you know, if you look at things like, you know, the work that Mike Sharples does on inquiry-based learning and citizen inquiry recently, you know, you see a lot of elements of that. So it's about, you know, training these habits of minds as a social capital. Now, yes, I mean, I think, you know, none of this is really new, and perhaps none of what we are saying today is new. So, you know, but I do draw on you know, and Dewey, Fouillé, you know, Papert, Schoon, names that have been mentioned. But I think still, although those ideas have traditions of, you know, at least 100 years, if we don't go back to Socrates, they have a different meaning today because of the prevalence of, you know, because we're living in a data-saturated, information-saturated, media-saturated society, and they take on a different form and in a way a different urgency. I actually want to finish off with James Baldwin, which I owe this quote to my daughter, who was doing internet research on Black Lives Matters. And, you know, just, you know, the paradox of education is precisely this. That is, one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which one is educated. And we need to actually enable our learners to question us. Yeah. Thank you.
Questions. So my question is really about how do we navigate our way through all this abundance of data and information and knowledge, because it seems to me that we're almost experiencing even more of a division than we've seen previously in history. There have always been people who have access to knowledge and data and are able to navigate that, and the people who absolutely don't have that, the opportunity to access. In theory, the internet opens up access, but are we seeing something which is quite different, where maybe there's even more of a divide than there was in the days when we had religious people in libraries and other people?
I think that's, you know, it's a very good question, because and you gave examples in your talk with the Mundwai-free MOOC, where some people simply don't have access to the MOOCs.
Yes.
But I think that issue of physical or digital access is really diminishing, and it's most people have some form of access. They might need to work harder or travel to the next village where they can climb on a tree and get signal. But still, that's diminishing. So the digital divide is going away. What's, I think, becoming more critical is the epistemic divide, yes. Is the fact that we have been bombarded, swamped with data and information, and we don't have the skills to deal with it. I suspect that maybe some of the kind of, you know, the sort of political disturbing phenomena that we see are a consequence of that we simply aren't equipped to dealing with this, you know, mass of oncoming information. And I'm not sure that I know how to deal with it all. So I think we're all learners in this space, and the best we can do is share our learning with others.
I'll ask a follow-on question also about data. There's a lot of talk in education these days that now that we can collect all this data, we'll be able to learn a lot more about how people learn, and then we'll be able to support them. And I have kind of two issues with that. One is, I would like to hear really concrete examples of where we have used the data in a way that I think is in line with the progressive pedagogies and yet helped people become better learners. And I just haven't seen very much, so it all feels a little theoretical and abstract to me at the moment. And then secondly, I think as we're going in that direction, you gave the example of Google Maps or Google, which I also think, and I talked to Mitchell this morning, like Google Maps is just this incredible tool, but I have absolutely no control over the data. Google knows everything about me and about everyone else, but I don't know what they know about me. I can't change it. I don't get access to the data. And so if we're thinking about kind of self-directed learning and autonomous learning, shouldn't the model be the exact opposite, where the individual has full control over all the data and can analyze it in whatever ways they want? But the direction we're heading in is much more centralized, not just Google, but also the universities, the for-profit technology companies. So like, what do you think about that tension, and where do you see that heading?
Well, I think the first thing is there are two questions there,
Yeah.
right? And one is about the nature of what we call learning analytics. And I think there is a confusion between study and learning. Mm-hmm. So another example of that is one of the most popular MOOCs around these days are How to Learn, mm-hmm. right? There's a How to Learn MOOC on Coursera. But if you look at the content, it's not how to learn in the sense that we've been talking about, it's how to study. Yeah. And a lot of the learning analytics is actually study analytics. Mm-hmm. It's, okay, what are the practices by which you would be a more efficient consumer of prepackaged knowledge, right? So I'm not saying that there aren't any examples of using analytics to actually track the things that we're talking about when we talk about learning. I'm not aware of any of those examples. Please, the world, Twitter, share examples with us. I mean, yes. Because really, these are things which I'm not sure really how do we measure. I mean, I was talking about when you learn, even if you're self-directed towards a goal, that goal will change when you learn, right? So even if the goal changes, then how can I measure how I'm progressing to the goal when the goal itself is moving, and that's positive, right? The other thing is yes, the commercialization and our relationship with these, mega corporates which hold the data. Now, Google actually has a pretty clear policy about your right to your data. I don't know if you've ever read it. I haven't, but I know it's there, which is why I tend to trust Google more than others, which may be that they've fooled me. So I'm not sure about my own data literacy here, let alone other people were less sensitive to this. Again, I think this is something that we still have to figure out, and maybe we need to figure out in an open space with more people, because.
One other comment, totally unrelated, but I was really struck in your post about the example you gave of learning to fix a bicycle tire, or I think a flat tire, and how it was with one of your children, and you said that you think that in the future that will still be a useful skill, even though learning to drive a car may not be. And I just thought it was such a, I don't know, somehow that stuck in my head, that sometimes we're very bad at knowing what are the skills that are going to be useful longer term versus others. But it also made me wonder, maybe it doesn't matter so much, because we spend so much time focusing on the specific skills and so little time focusing on the process of learning the skill, that if we focused on the process, then the skills become less important, because you develop the confidence that you can learn new things.
But the process itself is also changing, and that example was YouTube, is something that I didn't grow up with YouTube in my pocket, and yet nowadays when I want to pick up a new skill, I very naturally sort of open YouTube on my phone and do it, right? And that is a learning skill that I have, that I share with millions and millions of people, but some people don't. Mm-hmm. So there's that inequality even there.
Yeah. We'll be ready in a second. And actually, I'm happy that Yishay mentioned YouTube, because I didn't make a slide about YouTube. And I love talking about YouTube. There's a little study that we've started almost as a fun side project, super learners on YouTube. And I've started looking at who are the people that have learned like amazing things on YouTube. And there are people like there's a javelin thrower who went to the Olympics and won the silver medal, who says, from Kenya, who says that he learned kind of fine-tuned his skills by watching videos on YouTube. There's a family that built a house after it was destroyed in a natural disaster by watching YouTube videos on how do you build a house, and then they basically figured it out together. So I think it's super interesting to find those. Of course, they're, again, totally not representative, of everyone. But I hope that if we can find out how they got started and what process they used, even they may not even be aware of it, then we might be able to help other people employ the same strategies. But yeah, I think YouTube is. Yeah,
I think there's, and I've heard this in places where there's this kind of idealization of YouTube, where anyone can learn anything now. Just go to YouTube. But the first thing is you need to be motivated, and you need to know what you want to learn before you can find it on YouTube. And
yep, I totally agree. Like, how do you help people make that from, first give them the confidence that I'm interested in something, I'm going to go to YouTube, and then also what happens then? Like, what if they get stuck? What's the next thing? And YouTube does not do a good job at helping people. I just looked on the blog, our blog here, because I posted a YouTube video, and then when my YouTube video finishes, the 6 recommendations were all videos of Jimi Hendrix, which I was very happy about. But it's not particularly useful if you're trying to learn more about pushing the boundaries of higher education.
Yeah. I just want to say that a colleague of mine from Open University recently cycled in the World Transplant Games for the Dutch team. He looked up a lot of data on Strava to learn, well, how do you train to become a world champion? And they won the gold medal. It's not only because of Strava, but that was part of it, was learning. So what is the data from other people, and how do you train to become
can you open it not from the browser?
Yeah,
because the full screen is a little weird. I haven't used a Windows computer in 10 years, and I've never used one in Spanish, so this is...
It's a learning process.
It is a learning process. I'm going to have to look on YouTube. Yes, exactly. I've created a monster, I think. Okay, so I made a little video preparing for this, but then as the date got closer, I started thinking about, well, the theme is really pushing the boundaries of higher education. And what are the boundaries that I can think of that I think are worth pushing? And what does it look like if we push them? So I'm going to go through a few of those boundaries and then give some examples of where I see people pushing them, but also where maybe it would be good to push them a little more. So the first boundary is walls. A lot of higher education, is still, we're sitting in a physical space here. There's lecture halls, there are libraries, universities largely still tend to be physical spaces. And I see kind of as we're pushing against that boundary, the first step seems to be distance. So now we've got all this content, we're throwing it over the wall. The people on the other side, they get the materials, they read them, they throw something back. But we're still in 2 separate spaces. And so I think it would be interesting to think about if we went from distance to the next step and we thought of the university or the institution of higher education more as distributed. And what would that look like? And so here's an example from my own work. I co-founded a nonprofit called Peer-to-Peer University. And we've gone through a few iterations. And actually, we made a big shift exactly for the reasons that pretty much everyone before me mentioned, which is online-only learning tends to favor the highly educated. And so we shifted to blended learning, where people come together in learning circles, face-to-face in public libraries. And this is kind of our distribution model. And these are the 2 phases. The first phase, that's just Chicago on the left. So we worked with Chicago Public Library, and then it spread through the branches in Chicago. And then we moved kind of towards the US, and so now we're spreading through the US. And there are actually some dots in France, in Paris, and in Kenya, but not enough yet to make it worthwhile to put the global map. So there are a few other dots, but just kind of the idea of this is what a university could look like as well, right? Where you have this organic network of little dots that will start appearing all over the world, and somehow they are loosely connected, but they're not held back by walls anymore in the same way. So what does that look like? You know, it's more like small groups of people in physical spaces using open content and courses. So we only use open content. Oh, actually, that's not true anymore. But we favor using truly open content and courses. And we help people become learners where they rely on each other. So it's really a peer-to-peer learning model. There's no expert in the room. We give them recipes and strategies that they can use to support each other. And the librarians are there to make sure that the logistics are okay, that people have access to the internet. So they provide kind of the infrastructure, but the groups themselves support each other. Okay, so boundary 2, and I think this is one of the most important ones, is obedience. I think there's a sense of obedience in higher education where people are afraid to change the status quo or to challenge, afraid to do things that are different because then they're not going to get promoted, afraid to challenge the professor because then they're going to get bad grades. And so even though we're in this institution that was created for freedom, we now are seeing a lot, in my opinion, way too much obedience. So what's the solution to obedience? Disobedience. Here are some examples. At MIT, and this happens all over the world, at primarily engineering schools, but really all universities largely, there's a culture of hacking. And so in 2011, a bunch of students put up a fake fire truck on top of the MIT dome. And the dome is kind of the most eminent building on our campus. The graduation ceremonies happen in front of it. So this is like, we're a serious university. And one morning, you know, you have this red fire truck on top of the university. And now you could say, okay, this is just a prank. You know, this has nothing to do with learning. But I actually did a little study, and I interviewed the people responsible for this. And it's amazing what they had to do to make this happen. And in some ways, it's the kind of project that you would hope your engineering students would do when they're studying engineering. It's a team of 40 students. They worked for 3 months. They pulled this off overnight without anyone noticing. The thing is 50 meters high, so you have to get up on top of a 50-meter high building. Obviously, nobody should get injured. And then they made this so safe that they left instructions on the truck for the safety office. So when the safety office arrived, they could read the instructions on how they had put this thing up there. And it stayed up for 3 days because the safety office said, this is so well done that we have no concerns, and this can stay up here. So it's like, in some ways, this is what university should be, right? This is what our students should do. And now how can you know, so some of this is just some students do this, but there are ways as an institution to incentivize this. And one way that we at the Media Lab are doing it is Joey Ito created an award for disobedience. So every year now we give away $250,000 to someone who is an exceptionally disobedient person or group of people. But we're very clear also on what we mean by disobedience. So it has to be nonviolent, for example, and there was a big discussion. A lot of people from the outside said, you have to include violent resistance because some things cannot be done without violence. And no, regardless where you end on the spectrum, I'm firmly on the nonviolent side, but regardless where you sit, I think that is an incredibly interesting and important discussion to have inside an institution of higher education. Like, you know, what does it mean to be disobedient? When is it important? How would you structure disobedience? And so I think as universities, we can send signals that we would like our students and other people to act in certain ways. And in some ways, disobedience, I think, is at the core of science and progress. Third boundary, practice. It's kind of, I guess I was trying to combine a couple of things here together. But if you think about the relationship to content and instruction, then you know, you could make the argument that traditionally students are consuming content. They're sitting kind of like you right now, sitting and listening. Then there's the next step, which is they're creating content, they're creating knowledge, they're making things. But I want to talk about kind of what I think could come like beyond creating. One is deploy and the other one is lead. So at the Media Lab, we have our official motto is deploy, and it's kind of a riff on the traditional academic motto, publish or perish, where are you all familiar with the publish or perish thing? Yeah, all academics. Yeah, okay. So everyone's concerned about that. So when the Media Lab started, they said we don't do publish or perish, we do demo or die. So you have to demo your work so that people are inspired. And if you have nothing interesting to demo, then we're going to kick you out. And when Joey took over the Media Lab, he said, it feels like the world has changed so much that now we don't just have to demo, but we can actually deploy. And what that means is we build tools that people really use out there in the world. So they are research projects, but when you put them out and you get people using your research, you learn a lot more than if you just do it in a little lab. Actually, not always, of course, but generally, like the Scratch online community is a great example. It's a coding environment for kids that is being used by millions of children around the world, and the Scratch team has learned a ton about how to support a community of learners online by having a community of learners online rather than studying kind of communities of learners. And so there is something about like getting our students to deploy their work, to get their work out into the world. And then largely, I think leadership is something that is incredibly important in higher education as we think about pushing the boundaries. And leadership, it's not always the person you think is the leader. So on this photo, if I asked you who is the leader, if you know Joey Ito, you would probably say it's the Japanese gentleman in the front right. Turns out the leader is the young woman in the middle who is a student at the Media Lab and who was excited about the idea of doing something in space. And so she went ahead and started the Space Initiative and invited former astronauts and scientists and organized this incredible meeting called Beyond the Cradle. And now the Media Lab has a space initiative. We've actually hired a faculty member now to focus on space, Danielle Wood, on the top right. But really the leadership came from an individual master's student at the time. So like, how can we get our students to be leaders, but also how can we create spaces for them to be leaders? This one is very quick. Boundary 4 is the law, and closed and then open. And there's a twist. So open is kind of the easy one, right? Like publicly funded resources should be public goods. I think that's an easy argument to make. I think most of our institutions are in a position where we could openly license all of our materials. That doesn't seem like such a big stretch anymore, so that's something we should definitely do. But I also feel it's interesting to see when the space is not moving fast enough, how do we feel about things like this? Because in many ways, Sci-Hub is the world's largest repository of academic knowledge now, and it's so convenient that even the people at MIT, we have access to almost all of the German journals. Most people go to Sci-Hub rather than the library. It's just easier. You type in you get the article, there's the PDF. At the library, you have to go through the catalog and the complicated systems. So, I think there's an interesting argument to be made that sometimes it's okay to break the law in constructive ways, to push it along, or it's okay to at least challenge the law a little bit. So, but if we're pushing the boundaries, I think this is a great example. And then final one, the disciplines. I think we talk a lot about disciplines. The universities are organized in disciplines. We talk about interdisciplinary work, but that's often still the two disciplines talking to each other, meeting occasionally for lunch, submitting a joint research proposal. What about anti-disciplinary, where we let go of the disciplines? We focus on the problems. Like, it doesn't matter which language you speak and I speak. We should find a language together. So. I think in the context of institutions, there's some easy and there's some hard ways of doing this. An easy way of doing it is creating things like a director's fellowship, where you invite people who come from very different disciplines and backgrounds, but you make them part of your academic work. You invite them into the conversation, you listen to them, you learn their language, and so that's fairly easy to do, I would say. What's a little harder to do is, at the Media, we actually have an ongoing faculty search for a professor of the other. And that's someone who doesn't fit in anywhere else. So if you fit into an academic discipline somewhere else, you should go there. If you are the professor of other, then you should apply here. So finally, I think all of this in some ways connects to you. I really like the differentiation between study and learn. I think that's really good. I sometimes think about kind of learning versus education, and so often when we talk about these things, we pretend that they're the same thing, but they really aren't. Learning is this process that we tend to talk about here in this context. Education is the institutional setting and infrastructure and the systems that ideally support that, but very often they don't do that very well. And it's an industry, and there are all these other constraints. So just making sure we know which of the two are we talking about and how do they connect. That's it. Thank you. Hopefully there are some questions. One mini advertisement. We do have a new MOOC. Although we don't call it a MOOC, we don't even call it a course, and I don't know how to open a tab. Yes. lcl.media.mit.edu, learning creative learning, and it auto-translates into Spanish. Yes. It's an online learning community around creative learning. So if you're interested in creative learning, this might be interesting for you.
So I think we pushed the boundaries of time. And we were going to have coffee break 15 minutes ago. I mean, they are happy to, if we show up a little later. So I'll give you a choice if you want to ask each other's questions now or leave it for the Q&A.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I was really inspired by your presentation and all the ideas that you're giving, and of course the work you've done with peer-to-peer use, amazing, and the work out the Media Lab. But how do I
feel a big butt coming.
Well, this is something that I've struggled with my whole career, and it's how to take innovations and really put them at the core of institutions. I guess my question to you is, one of the things you did was create something new and bubble it up, and that's a challenge in itself. But actually changing the institutions that we have is perhaps even more challenging, or challenging in a different way. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about the second of those. Is it possible for us to do it, or should we dismantle our universities and build new ones? It's a serious question.
Can I add a bit to that question, because
since that wasn't hard enough,
no, I mean, just right. So, well, this is stream of consciousness a bit, but when we were talking about disobedience and MIT's reward for disobedience, and about sort of bending the law in order to allow freedom of knowledge, and the name that came to my mind was Aaron Swartz.
Yeah.
And that's where so MIT might have an admirable position on this. Other institutions don't.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't sure where you were going, but I think Aaron Swartz is a good example where MIT has, in my opinion, fallen short of its own ideals. I mean, we could spend a long time talking about that particular case, and I think it perfectly highlights your point.
Yes.
Large institutions are, kind of like the. Well, I don't want to say like the Titanic. Let's say like a big cruise ship. They're very difficult to maneuver, and my instincts have always been to not try to change large systems from the inside out, but to work on the outside. And I feel very fortunate now that Joey allowed me to be kind of an innovator on the fringes of an institution. But even the Media Lab is not a representative, it's not a common model for what higher education looks like. We are largely funded by industry contributions. They don't get to direct our research. We've built up a brand that lets us do things that I think are hard to do, even in other parts of MIT. And so how do you change large institutions? I think ultimately it always has to come from the outside, but if you are strategic about it, I think you can try to do this innovation yourself, or at least protect it yourself, and so that it isn't necessarily other people who are. And I actually remember when I came to MIT, I met the president, Reif, who had just become president, And I asked him about, okay, what's your vision for digital learning and for technology? And I was really impressed because he said, I don't know exactly how it will change the role of the university, but I know it will change the role of the university. And I would rather be the person that changes it than watching someone else change it. And so I think he's had a commitment trying to do lots of interesting things, many of whom, as usual, don't work. But hopefully some of them will do. And the other example is Southern New Hampshire University, which actually I'm not a huge fan of their online learning program, but I am impressed by the way the president has said, we are going to set up essentially competition for our own university. And in order to do that, I am going to set up a completely separate unit that doesn't have to report to the same committees and structures, and I will protect them. And then the funny thing is he did that once, that worked very well, and then he wanted to do a competency-based online degree. And the same people he had protected before said, oh yeah, we should be doing that because we're the experts for online learning. And he said, no, I'm going to set up another unit. I'm going to protect them from you because now you are the status quo. So I think you have to create new things kind of loosely affiliated with you and protect them from the core. And then if they grow and they flourish, then either you switch and become them or you have two things. But yeah, it's extremely hard.